We have to be honest. The work that we do as educators is too often very thankless. I worked in education my entire adult life, and I still struggle to recall moments when I have heard those words. So I like to really allow us an opportunity to be able to look and when we're with our colleagues to say thank you. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Last night was tough, right? Like last night was really tough. So I just thought I would bring Golden State here with us today. A few years ago, I read this book called Rising Strong by Brené Brown. And in it, she has this quote that I think is really, really powerful. She says, "I want to be in the arena. I want to be brave with my life. And when we make the choice to dare greatly, we sign up to get our asses kicked. We can choose courage or we can choose comfort, but we can't have both, not at the same time. A lot of cheap seats are filled with people who never venture to the floor. They just hurl mean-spirited criticisms and put-downs from a safe distance. Every person in this room, you are all in the trenches. You do the incredibly challenging and the incredibly rewarding work of being an educator. And there are always those people on the sidelines who think that they can do better than you, but they don't have the courage to do what it is that you actually do. So they stay to the side and they criticize the work that you are doing. That's why we started this session right here with a moment of gratitude, because we have to encourage each other when others won't. We have to thank each other for daring to do the work that others criticize, but they won't do themselves. So thank you for that. I want to stress today, though, that your jobs are getting more and more difficult, in part because the conditions that your students come from are getting more and more difficult. And unfortunately, in the state of Arizona and across the nation, the state and local policies don't seem to address those conditions that our students come from. So that makes our job a lot more challenging. And in order for us to continue to serve our students, we have to become aware and familiar with those conditions that our students come from. When I was a teacher, a high school teacher, this is one of the thoughts that I always had in my head, because it helped me to position myself when I was with my students, is that students are products of their circumstances, but they do not have to be defined by them. Our students come from incredibly difficult backgrounds, and they are academically fragile. Now, I use the word fragile there because throughout their educational careers, education has made them to believe that who they are isn't a good fit to be successful. Schools have told our students that unfortunately that they aren't good enough to be able to be successful, and unfortunately some of our students have internalized those messages. Those students start to believe those ideas, and we all have some students who are about this close to giving up, to throwing in the towel, and to just walking away from schools. And they need you all in this room to continue to encourage them and to let them know that they can be themselves and still be top of the class. And that their academic struggles are not necessarily because of what they lack intellectually, but it's because what they have is not seen as valuable in schools. I want to start today with a story from when I was a high school teacher. It was my first year as a high school English teacher. I was fresh out of college. I had barely unpacked my new apartment in Washington, D.C. I was standing there on the first day of class, and a stampede of students ran right past me. And there was one student in particular who stood out to me. She was a short, hefty young woman. Her hair was this bright and beautiful strawberry red that neatly accented her brown, round face. It cut so close that you could barely see the oversized hoop earring in her left nostril. And it wasn't her physical appearance that branded her memory in my mind. It was the sound that preceded her. Hey! 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 This is what she did as she entered my classroom. She was loud. If her excitement was any indication to how my year was going to go as a teacher, then I was in for an enormous feat. As the school year moved slowly toward June, I learned a lot of things about myself, about Romel, the loud young lady who I met on the first day, and about education. I learned that Romel came to school each and every day as the most authentic version of herself. In addition to the books and the pens that she carried in her backpack, Romel also brought with her the teachings of her grandparents, the teachings of her community, of her neighborhood, the teachings of her race, her culture, her gender, and her sexual proclivities. I learned that I too brought my understandings of race and culture with me every single day, and my understandings didn't always align with my students' understandings, despite the fact that overwhelmingly we all fit into the same racial category. I learned that my training in education had prepared me to educate a particular type of student of a particular race from a particular socioeconomic background who was part of a particular culture. I learned that something about the way schools were organized, something about the policies and practices and the curriculum were in complete opposition to the realities of the students that sat before me day in and day out. Something about school didn't quite work for my students, and I had to witness, as their teacher, them every single day fighting to change who they are to fit into schools. I later came to realize that it's because schools, and I know that you all know this already, schools are designed to maintain an institution of whiteness and a disregard for blackness. Where the success of white students is the norm and the failure of black and brown students is to be expected. Where the primary instruction is taught in English and history lessons tell a story of slavery where blacks are nothing but property. Where the white way is the right way. I want to get a little interactive for this next part. You guys mind helping me with that? Take a look at this image. I know some of us may have seen this before. Some of us may remember this particular image. Take a look at this image. What thoughts come to mind? Yep. White is clean. That white is clean. What else? What other thoughts come to mind? What message is this image portraying? That black is dirty. What else? That white is preferred. That it's not right to be black. Yep, all of these things are correct. What else?
It looks like inside is white and outside is black.
Inside is white and outside. You can just take it off and throw it out. Yep. Yep. In the back.
Corporations aren't understanding how they're being offensive.
Yeah, and corporations aren't understanding how they're being offensive. This was actually an ad that was released in 2017 by Dove. It was a Facebook ad that was released in 2017 by Dove. But this wasn't the first time that Dove had released a racist ad. It happened again in 2011, just a few years prior. From this ad, you can literally see a woman in a dark shirt taking off the dark shirt, which takes off her dark skin, and at the end, what results is this happy-go-lucky white woman sitting next to this bottle of soap, which represents cleanliness, that we can just wash away all that is dirty, all that is dark, and somehow result in this white preferred ending, right? Let's go to this next one. What about this one? What ideas do you see from this particular image? Yep, what ideas come from this image? We have a black woman who, the black girl who someone says is an armrest. What else comes from this? What else do we see? She's wearing a different color shirt. She's not smiling. There's no Mexicans in this image. That's right. What else? What else do we see here?
The white girl is oppressing the young black girl.
The white girl is oppressing the young black girl. Someone else had something?
The little black girl, like she has to kind of dim her shine amongst like the white girl.
Yep.
And she has to say love. She can't be adventurous.
Mm.
Because if she's adventurous, then people might get scared of her.
So we've got adventure, and we got trailblazer, and then we have
Yeah.
love.
Then we have,
Yeah, peace, love.
so we even see these messages. Last one in the back.
She lacks the potential in flexibility of being adaptable.
Oh, absolutely. She lacks in some sort of flexibility. She can't do what the other girls are doing, right? This was an image. So Ellen DeGeneres, who we all love, partnered with Gap to do this advertising around women, girls can do everything. And this was at the end of the commercial that they ran. This was the last image of the commercial. And we see the young lady on here doing this acrobatic stance, and then the one on the right side of the frame that she has her leg up and she's being able to be a ballerina, right? So from this, looking at the surface, you get the idea that girls can do anything, except if you're a black girl. Then what you can be is a prop in the photo. Then what you can be is an armrest for, look at the dynamics of this picture. The white girl is literally standing superior, standing over the black girl. And she's even flexing her muscle. We even see her exercising a muscle, which is power, over the black girl. And she smirks. What amazes me about both of these images is not necessarily that they are sending a racial message to its consumers, but that these advertisements went through several layers of approval. They were scripted, they were filmed, take one and take two, and let's do it again, let's try it again. And then the board sat in the room and they approved it and they signed off in the air. And at no point did somebody say, wait a minute, this ain't right, right? And that's exactly how whiteness and white supremacy works. It presents the subtleties that resonate with our uncritical, unconscious mind as to not raise alarm. It attempts to connect with something that's already ingrained in us because we possess a mental model, so when we see it, we often just normalize it. We don't question it. And so white supremacy continues to seep into our everyday. In order for whiteness to be superior, that means that something else has to be inferior. This, therefore, necessitates that Black, Indigenous, Latinx people be positioned as inferior. And in some ways, we get Asian groups who are held as some Asian groups who are held in this minority, in this model minority stereotype, which is equally as problematic. White supremacy is really helpful as a framework to help us explain, I'm gonna get that later. White supremacy is really helpful as a framework because I think it helps to explain how we got to where we are as a country, but it doesn't quite go far enough to help us to understand the precarious conditions of Blacks in our society and in our schools. I think anti-Blackness helps us to get a little bit closer to doing that. White supremacy is defined as a system of oppression intended to maintain white, often male, heterosexual, right, cisgender dominance. Anti-Blackness, on the other hand, is an active and subconscious disdain and disregard for Blackness. It's this idea that Blackness is socially constructed as non-human. So what does all this mean for education? Let's look at some data. In terms of statewide enrollment, the state of Arizona, 5% of Arizona's students are Black. That comes to about 55,000 students. Almost half the students in this state identify as Latinx. Slightly over 40% of students across the state receive free and reduced lunch. Sorry about the percent of 5 to 17-year-olds. I realize that color isn't too helpful for us. Let's look at some more data. According to recent AZ Merit Assessment results, about 1 in 3 Black students receive a passing grade score proficient on the state's 4th grade reading assessment. That's about the same amount as students who are categorized as low income, and students with disability is about 16%. Now, I highlight this category because we know how black and brown males in particular are disproportionately represented in students with disabilities. I think it's important to bring that up here. It's important to also note that 64%, over half of white students are scoring proficient on these same assessments. Similar trends exist for 8th grade math students, with only 23% of black students receiving a passing grade compared to over half of white students. And we don't just see these inequities in our assessment and achievement numbers, we can also see these inequities in other data. Last year, Education Trust did a study and they wanted to see how money was being spent. And what they found out was that a combined amount of state and local funds will go, schools with the highest amount of poverty, districts with the highest amount of poverty, were receiving just about the same amount of funds as schools with the lowest level of poverty. Yeah. That means districts with the highest need, districts who serve students with the highest financial need are receiving just about the same as districts who serve students with the lower financial need. How can we wrap our head around that? How does that even make sense? And this one always gets me, right? Because this idea that this is problematic on so many levels. But this data tells us that the schools that have the most students of color have the fewest number of teachers that are rated, have the most teachers who are rated ineffective and the fewest amount of teachers rated highly effective. Now, we can unpack this on so many levels, right? Because I think first, if we say that our most struggling students need the best teachers, this data doesn't show that. But then we can also say, how are we rating our teachers? What makes you an effective teacher and highly effective? Because in so many ways, that means the work that we do in this room, working with primarily black and brown students, isn't valued as effective, right? So we can unpack this on so many levels. I think this points directly to some of the bigger issues with policy that's operating at the state level. I don't think this data is coincidental. Taken together, the data show that something in the stew ain't right. The way that education is set up across this country continues to keep black students and students from low-income backgrounds in the lowest quartile across several educational indicators. These numbers do not reflect the brilliance of our students of color or our low-income students. These numbers don't measure their intelligence nor their engagement. It's not about their parents or their geographies. Our schools refuse to recognize black and brown brilliance, period. Our students aren't performing well, not because they aren't intelligent or because they don't care. It's because the rules that we have constructed for schools, it's because the rules of schools that instruct students on how to engage and be successful are diametrically opposed to the cultural backgrounds that our students bring with them to class every single day. The way that we measure and value success suggests that our students have to fit into a certain box in order to be regarded as successful. They have to be a certain way, they have to act a certain way, they have to think and perform a certain way. From the way that students' behaviors are policed in classrooms to how we monitor their bodies signal to our students that who they are does not belong in school. And then we organize schools according to ability and by virtue race. When we ignore their culture when we ignore their culture in our curricular decisions, we are telling our students that they don't have a place in our school. When Romel walked into my classroom for the first time, she was loud. Some people would call her obnoxious. Some people might even say she was ratchet. Have y'all heard that before? Ratchet? That's not a new term, is it? No. Let's break it down. Just to make sure we're on the same page, let's break it down. Ratchet. Sometimes we just got to go there, right? So we can all be on the same page. We got to get on the same page. Ratchet, to exemplify all negative characteristics associated with urban spaces. To be loud, to be obnoxious, to be flamboyant in appearance. If schools view Romel as only ratchet, then they are saying that she is anti-intellectual. They are saying that her identity stands counter to the type of student that schools are intended to serve. That means that she is unable to be educated, as the opposite of sophisticated, the opposite of how schools have constructed what it means to be an academic. Both race and place are implicated in this term, and it says that Romel doesn't fit in that box. Ratchet is often used synonymously with ghetto. We've heard that before as well. And then Romel walks into some schools, and some teachers communicate to Romel either implicitly or explicitly that if she is going to be loud or boisterous and rowdy and not submissive and not docile, and that if she's going to be all of those things, then she can't be in school. So we kick her out. Or we make schools so uncomfortable, so outside of her culture, of who she is, that she decides to leave. Either way, that's our fault. But how can we disrupt the devaluing and dehumanization of students' identities and better support their development as scholars? How can we stop looking at Romel as the problem and instead see schools as the problem? How can we tell our students that it is okay to be who you are in school? How can we educate someone who is both ratchet and sophisticated? Someone who is both ratchet and academic? How can we educate, appreciate, and motivate a student who is sophisticated? How can we celebrate a ratchetemic? What might that look like? To define these terms, I draw from some other scholars, especially Chris Emden, and I define, let's go back to definitions because we got to be on the same page. So I define sophisticated and ratchetemic as an expression of sophistication and intellectual academic ability concurrently with an emphasis on the embodiment of what may be perceived as dispositions, leanings, sensibilities that reify negative societal perceptions of blackness. Romel can be both sophisticated and ratchet. Romel can be who she is and still succeed in school. It means that the term sophisticated means that Romel can be loud, and she can come from the hood, and she can be perceived as all those negative tropes that are conjured up around black people who grew up in poverty, and at the same time, she can be brilliant and worthy of the best education from the best teachers in the best schools. But in order for this to happen, it necessitates that educators, all educators, us in this room, and even those who are not in this room, it necessitates that we value her cultural identity while also developing her academic identity. See, in education, we have constructed this dichotomy where students have to choose. Students have to either be sophisticated or they can be ratchet. Where students have to either be ratchet or they can be academic. And then we attempt, so that we can teach them, we attempt to strip away their culture and expect them to leave it at the door when they come into our classrooms and our schools. And then when students decide to be their authentic selves, when students decide that who they want to be is who their parents and grandparents and cultures have taught them to be, we punish them for it. We make them feel like they don't belong in school, like they are ineducable. We measure them using instruments that have been developed with their failure in mind. We punish Romel for having the courage to be Romel. When I was a teacher, in order for me to educate Romel and so many students who came to me being their authentic selves, Zogi and Ashanti and Deshaun, all of those students who came to me every single day, living out loud, I had to first be able to appreciate their brilliance, their bravery. We have to understand that students carry with them a form of integrity that cannot be measured on tests or quantified and percentages. These students have courage to be who they truly are, and that decision is often a decision of survival. It's a condition of legacy, it's a circumstance of being, it's about heritage. So let me ask you this. Do you know what brilliance looks like, even if it doesn't look like you? Can you recognize brilliance if it does not walk or talk or smell or sound the way that you do? Can you recognize brilliance when it stands against everything that we have learned that brilliance is supposed to look like? As culturally relevant teachers and leaders, our job is not to punish our students, but to educate, appreciate, and motivate them. We do this by disrupting the dichotomy between their cultures and schooling, and the culture of school, if you will. We do this by centering who they are in the curriculum, in our policies, in our conversations, and our opportunities. We motivate them by encouraging them to live out loud, and then we provide them with the academic tools to be successful in school and in society. We remind them that they are not broken, but the system that they trust to educate them is what's broken. We tell our students to come as you are, and we don't hold that against them. And we recognize and remember that schools are not designed with them in mind. I want to think more concretely for a few moments about what some of those practices might look like. What does it look like for culturally responsive leaders to embrace the expressions of students' identities and voices who are most often marginalized in schools? I have 4 things here that I want to talk about and go through in the time that we have. I don't know how much time we have, but I'm going to keep going. I'll just keep going, and then when I reach my time, y'all just pull me off, because I'm going to keep going. The first thing, culturally responsive leaders have to understand that to accept some identities and to reject others is a form of bigotry. It's an act of violence, period. There is no way around it. It's an act of violence that dehumanizes our students, their families, and their cultures. And when we do this, we are complicit in maintaining white supremacy. When we see a student who has a Black Lives Matter t-shirt on and we say that student's being disruptive or provocative, when we have a student who wears their cultural attire or their cultural meanings to class and they bring those things with them and we shun them for it, we are maintaining white supremacy. When we tell our students that they can't speak their native language in our classrooms, we are maintaining white supremacy. We are complicit in maintaining white supremacy. We can't be both. We can't say that we're culturally relevant, culturally responsive, culturally appropriate, culturally revealing. We can't be culturally anything if we are also complicit in maintaining white supremacy. Period. Number 2, culturally responsive leaders establish social and educational networks that are beneficial to minoritized students, families, communities, and teachers. I'm going to come back to this one at the end of the talk. But it's important to know that students need networks. Students need to be able to be connected with people who look like them so that they can also support each other. Just how we turned to our neighbor at the beginning of this and we said, thank you for what you do. Students need to hear that from their peers. And as leaders, we need to establish the possibility and the potential for that to happen for students. Number 3, culturally responsive educators and leaders identify, protect, and honor minoritized students' identities by understanding community-based contexts from which the identities come and humanize them to resist exclusion. This is important, right? I think at the heart of this says that we need to get out into the communities. We need to get to know our students and their families. I also think that at trainings like this, that idea is said so many times, right? We hear that a lot. Get into the community, get to know our students, get to know their families. And in some ways, it tends to fall on deaf ears. After I finished teaching in DC, I went back as a researcher, and I was doing some research in some schools in DC. And there was this one principal in DC who started this initiative called Taking Over the K. And the K was for Martin Luther King Park, which was this huge park that sat at the center of the neighborhood. And What that initiative was that this principal took the entire staff outside of the building as a form of professional development. So once a year, annually, they would take over Martin Luther King Park. The educators would go to this park. They would have an old-fashioned barbecue. They would throw some hot dogs on the grill. They would play dominoes. They would play basketball. They would wash the cars from people in the community. They would invite the community to be a part of that. What you get there is an exchange. You get the teachers who aren't from that community having the opportunity to go out and engage with community members, and you also get community members being able to learn from the teachers who they trust their children with. There wasn't a person in that neighborhood that you can ask who was unfamiliar with taking over the K. And this principal had done this for several years, and in 2017, 100% of the seniors graduated and got accepted to a 2 or 4 year college. The school was 99% African American. It's initiatives like that that work. It's initiatives like that that say the school is here we care about the community. We are connected, we are understanding, and we are really trying to bridge this partnership. And number 4, culturally responsive teachers and leaders use community-based and ancestral knowledge to help teachers understand and appreciate minoritized student identities. This, again, is related to the Taking Over the K initiative that I just spoke about moments ago. Later in the breakout session, I'm going to talk a little bit more about these 4, and we'll work in groups to think about what are some concrete ways that we can do these things in the work that we do every day. Because I think it's important, if we can use these as a place to start, we can really start to create movements around our school. Returning back to number 2 for a minute, establishing social and educational networks that are beneficial to our students, I want to talk a little bit about a project that I'm doing right now in Tucson schools, or in one school in particular. So I have a project that I call Spaces of Hope. And in this project, I am examining affinity groups that have been designed for students to come together and talk about a number of different things. For those who may be unfamiliar, an affinity group is a loosely organized space that all the participants are connected through either some form of identity or ideology, and they're able to come together and talk about issues and express issues that are relevant to them as a collective. Students, especially middle and high school students who are more frequently engaged in everyday race moments, need an opportunity to develop, to deeply discuss these moments when they encounter race and how they think and feel about those moments. The group that I've been working with for the past few months was developed by Jimmy Hart. I know he's in here somewhere. Jimmy Hart. Let's give Jimmy a round of applause for that work. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you. And I'm not sure if Principal Brock is in here. He may not be, but that is it. It happens at his school. So a hand for him in his absence for allowing that to take place. Thank you. Assistant principal's here. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. So at Palo Verde High School, me along with a number of other adult men meet with a group of young men once a week for about an hour. And in these meetings, students have the opportunity with adults to talk about issues of race and racism and how it appears in education, in society, in criminal justice system, and even in our own backyards. Students ask and discuss these engaging topics with adults. They share their stories, but most importantly, the students' voices are central to those sessions. Students develop the language and the acumen to identify injustice when it's happening in their classrooms, in their schools, and they are becoming equipped with the tools to address them and demand equity. It's spaces like that where students can say, I'm not alone in this. Sometimes when I come to school, I feel like my culture or my identity is being compromised. Another student can say, yeah, that's happening to me too, and this is how I feel. And then together we can all work through what does that mean? What does that mean for us? So that students aren't internalizing those messages. So that students aren't hearing that they don't belong in schools, but they then have a space or a place, a space of hope, where they can go and talk to others who share those identities, who may be dealing with the same struggles, who may be dealing with the same challenges, to figure out how can we navigate this? What is it that we can do? And I think those spaces are really, really important. As I alluded to earlier, schools are racialized institutions where students are constantly bombarded with messages about race and other aspects of their identity from a variety of sources. So these messages inform students' attitudes and beliefs about who they are and who they can be in society. Affinity spaces is just but one area that students can learn to handle and address those messages. There's so much focus on being culturally relevant, we don't talk enough about what it means to be culturally irrelevant. Because you can be one or the other. Schools are designed to maintain white supremacy, as I have stated before. And they do that through the oppression of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other students of color, essentially by requiring a stripping of their culture in order for them to be considered educable. Part of how white supremacy works is by subtly slipping into our subconscious minds that we sometimes normalize the logics of whiteness and suggest whiteness is good and Blackness or non-white is bad. When it happens in our subconscious, we sometimes don't even recognize that it's happening. Just like those ads that we saw earlier in the presentation. In this talk, I have demonstrated that students come to our class and they bring with them their own cultural backgrounds, their lived realities with them to school. And as educators, we cannot explicitly nor implicitly tell our students that their culture should be left at home or should be left at the door. Instead, we need to embrace and humanize their identities. And we do this in part by establishing protocols and policies that respect and honor our students and where they come from. Culturally relevant teaching and leadership is one way through which this is done. Now, if we don't humanize and incorporate students' identity into the everydayness of school, we run the risk of being culturally irrelevant leaders. Now, finally, I want to be clear about one more thing, and I think it's always necessary to say. Culturally responsive training in and of itself will not dismantle and disrupt structural racism. We come to these sessions and we learn, what these sessions help us to do is help us to make sure that our students know that they are brilliant. These sessions remind us and they teach us how to communicate brilliance to our students and how to see their brilliance. That's what these sessions do. But these sessions alone cannot and will not dismantle structural racism. This is the first and a very necessary step in doing that work. But we have to continue to do that. We have to continue to be active, to be conscious. We have to continue to be intentional about how we dismantle and how we address white supremacy in our schools. So I leave you with one question. What will you do to dismantle white supremacy in your classroom and in your schools? Thank you.